Hello and welcome to the READ seminar series. Today we're going to hear from Keith Barney and Kanya Suksakun on their recent paper, which is available online, open access on Credit Crunch, Chinese infrastructure lending and Lao sovereign debt. My name is Anna Monero and I'm a postdoc research fellow at the Crawford School and I'm working as part of the Water Justice Hub. And before we get into the presentation, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Nuga Water country in the southwest of Western Australia, and the sovereignty over this country was never ceded. And I acknowledge the traditional owners of all the countries from where people who are participating in this seminar are now sitting on. So I'll briefly introduce Keith and Kanya. Keith is a senior lecturer in Resource, Environment and Development Group at the Crawford School of Public Policy. Keith has conducted research on resource governance, agrarian change, and environmental policy issues in Laos since 2004. Kanya Suksakun is a PhD candidate at the Crawford School of Public Policy. Kanya's doctoral project investigates the political economy of the Mekong regional energy scapes and social sustainability in Laos. He has 10 years of professional experience in environmental and social impact assessment and teaches water resource governance at the National University of Laos. So thanks very much, Keith and Kanya, for putting your hand up to deliver this seminar. I look forward to hearing about your research. Over to you, Keith and Kanya.
Okay, I'll share my screen. And then go like that. Okay, so does that work?
It is working now, yes,
okay,
thank you.
Great. Okay, so I prepared a script today, so to make sure my words are precise. So that'll sort of be how I approach the presentation. So thanks for coming everybody today. I've actually been a little bit under the weather this week, so just as well that this is being held by a Zoom. And after this, I think I'll be heading back home to go under the blankets. So for this session, I'll be presenting this joint paper that Kanya and I wrote, published in our in-house Crawford School journal, Asia and the Pacific Policy Studies. And Kanya has been spending some long hours in Stanner building and the library getting his PhD thesis ready for submission. So in an effort not to distract him too much from that foremost work, I'll be handling the presentation, but then both of us can respond to the questions and answers and discussion afterwards. You'll have a chance to hear more of Kanya's fascinating research in Laos through his final PhD presentation coming up in July. So as background to this presentation, I should say that I'm a geographer, not an economist or an energy sector specialist. So it's been a bit of a learning curve to understand certain aspects of things like how electricity grids function and the organization of sovereign debt markets. But I do follow resource developments in Laos very closely as a country specialist, including the hydropower sector. And in early 2020, I think I became interested to better understand this issue of Laos sovereign debt and to trace as best I could what was behind this and what were the main drivers and what were some of the practical options for Laos moving forward. Kanya, meanwhile, is indeed a full expert on the hydropower sector, having worked as an industry consultant for many years as a social safeguard specialist. So the paper was a useful collaboration. At the same time, you might have been seeing in the news or on Twitter that there's been a lot of rhetoric around so-called debt trap diplomacy in Laos and questions regarding China's role and strategic interests in Southeast Asia and the Mekong region. I'll have a little bit to say about that at the end of the talk. And finally, we didn't purposely set out to weigh down our article published in the journal with lots of heavy abstract academic theorizing. And we could have taken it in several directions on, for example, geographies of state sovereignty and financialization, or looking in detail at the value relations of Lao hydropower. For the article, we sort of tried to just tell the policy story in an interesting and compelling manner, because I think it alone stands on its own as a very important and interesting case. There's likely another paper in there where we could do more theorizing on this. Perhaps that's something we could talk about in the question and answer period. So that's how we approached the article published in our journal. And basically we look at how the battery of Southeast Asia seemed to go sort of off the rails, as you could say. What does this have to do with sovereign debt? What role did China's policy banks and other lenders play in this? And how serious is the situation? And what are Laos's options moving forward? So while I won't develop a theoretical framework, I will introduce a few concepts that I think are useful to keep in mind when considering the political economy of hydropower in Laos. And the first point draws from a paper submitted by historian Simon Creek and myself. And we've been working on trying to understand and provide an explanation for regime durability in Laos. We ask in that paper how it is that the Lao People's Revolutionary Party, from very modest and tentative beginnings, has defied so many predictions by not just staying in power since 1975, but consolidating their rule and even thriving. And on the one hand, you have many explanations that focus on issues of corruption and patronage, the idea that the party is little else but a front for extractive interests. And on the other hand, you'll often see the idea that the Lao People's Revolutionary Party has sort of run out of ideas, that the party's ideological framework of Marxism-Leninism is completely moribund and discredited, and that maybe it's more political inertia combined with economic growth that keeps the system going. So we thought that both of these explanations were missing something important, and that's the Lao regime's efforts to continuously innovate on their system of rule. And in the paper with Simon Creek, we argue to pay more attention to what the party actually says it's doing, which is in fact building socialism. The party is not simply a front for patronage and corruption, although that's certainly part of the story. Instead, we need to look more closely at the innovations of the regime, including through things like facilitating foreign investment and consolidating the party state's rule over Lao society, or what we call statism. Creek and I proposed the triplet of statist market socialism as capturing this approach quite well. And the paper elaborates on how the regime continuously innovates across three areas, including through resourcification, or turning nature into commodifiable natural resources. Second, through institutions, we look at the flurry of legislative activity and constitutional amendments that characterize the activities of the National Assembly, for example. And third, in terms of ideology, including the ideology of single-party leadership, the 5-year planning system, and graduating from least developed country status. All of these innovations, we argue, help promote party legitimacy that together combine into what Norihiko Yamada has called the ideal of socialism with the reality of reform. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll invite you to consider how hydropower reflects these points and how central hydropower is to the overall socialist state building efforts of the Lao People's Revolutionary Party. Our second sort of conceptual starting point is drawn from a very insightful PhD thesis completed in 2018 by a scholar named Pon Suvanasinghe, where she talks about the narrow path to development for Laos following its liberalization reforms in the 1980s. Hydropower was a key resource that the Lao state could leverage for generating foreign exchange earnings. However, the post-World War II Bretton Woods era system in which Western states might help to directly finance a domestic electricity grid, as was the experience with US support for Thailand's electricity generation authority back in the 1950s, this era was clearly over. Because of the Indochina conflicts, Laos and Cambodia both missed this phase altogether and leapt more directly into a more neoliberal model for promoting resource-based development. The 1990s in Laos saw the emergence of new lending mechanisms such as public-private partnerships in the hydropower sector. In Laos, these PPP mechanisms have been organized into what are called independent power producers, or IPPs, organized through different modalities such as the build, own, operate, transfer model. And this gets a bit complicated, but one of the key implications of this mode of investing in Lao hydropower was that the independent power producers would tend to limit their sovereign risk in investing in a socialist country like Laos by setting up their own direct transmission lines to end customers, which were usually in Thailand. When the revenues for the first IPP project started to roll in, such as with the Thun Hin Bun Dam in central Laos in 1998, that's when the government of Laos really started to fully realize the money that could be made through hydropower development. But the result of this was a patchwork and fragmented domestic electricity grid, which was focused on building infrastructure for direct exports, not for servicing the Lao domestic energy market. This is an issue which will come up in the sovereign debt story later. And our third concept, or starting point, relates to the idea of bureaucratic and regulatory disconnects. While the Lao People's Revolutionary Party may indeed be highly institutionalized and in many ways innovative, the Lao bureaucracy itself still suffers from poor coordination, interministerial competition, and horizontal and vertical disconnects, which do not always favor equitable water resource governance or efficient infrastructure investment. And Kanya's thesis does an excellent job of documenting these disconnects that operate not just sort of horizontally between the national level line agencies, such as the competition between the Ministry of Planning and Investment, the Ministry of Energy and Mines, and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. These disconnects also operate vertically through the hierarchical governance structure that lead from national to provincial to district to village level authorities in Laos. And to add a little bit more complexity, shadowing this complex bureaucratic system is the Lao People's Revolutionary Party, which has the final say on key decision-making processes. So that's a bit of introduction to understanding the Lao context. I'll just say a few words about methods that we used for this paper, though we didn't talk about this at length in the actual published version. Briefly, the methods we used drew, first of all, upon many years of research experience in Laos and familiarity with the key actors and projects and the literature on Lao hydropower. Actually, when I reflected back on my methods, I found that I drew particularly on Twitter for tracing updated information on the debate on China's BRI and developing country sovereign debt, including close analysis of reports from Moody's and Fitch rating agencies, when these were not locked behind paywalls. Conversations with scholars within the Crawford School, such as Adam Triggs and Shiro Armstrong, also helped me to understand the debt market options for Laos, although they're not responsible for my interpretation. And I think this highlights some of the benefits of tapping into the significant expertise across disciplines and departments that we have in the Crawford School. Kenya, as mentioned in this slide, drew upon his PhD research, which includes extensive interviews with key actors and institutions in the Lao hydropower sector. Okay, so from the battery of Southeast Asia to high-speed rail, it's been really quite amazing to see the infrastructure transformations in Laos that have happened over the last 15 years. And in considering sovereign debt issues, the US $5.9 billion Lao China Railway has captured a lot of attention. While by all accounts, the government of Laos has struggled to come up with the budget financing for this project, when you look in more detail, it seems the railway financing alone does not seem to be driving Laos into debt distress, although it's probably not helping either. For a total Lao contribution of 715 million, 250 million over 5 years was drawn from the national budget, and this was supported by a 465 million concessionary loan from China's Exim Bank. And for that contribution, Laos gets 30% of the Lao China Railway Company. Now, there are going to be operational and maintenance costs, of course, and in fact, some expert forecasts project that the railway will not be turning a profit for the foreseeable future. And you know, the Thai connection of the railway is just getting started, for example, and it's going to be at least 7 or 8 years before that is finished. There's also power demand issues for the railway that will be touched on later. But it seems instead, it's not so much the railway project, but it's more squarely the hydropower sector that we argue has been more central to Lao debt dynamics, especially the debts accrued through what can be called the second and third waves of investors, as mentioned on the slides here. And lending from China is key to both. So, you know, these issues started to accelerate at the start of 2020, and the COVID crisis was certainly a bit of a tipping point. But the roots of the issue, of course, go back far earlier. Concerns over Lao debt started to be mentioned around maybe 2015 and 16, around the time of the railway project, when people were speculating on whether this was actually affordable for the Lao government. And further indicators from the World Bank and IMF in terms of debt vulnerability were starting to pick up through 2017, 18, and 19. But for me, it was in probably December 2019 when I really started to notice something concrete. And this was when the government of Laos issued an 18-month US $150 million Laos sovereign bond at a 6.875% interest rate. So this was quite remarkable, I thought, in a world of ultra low interest rates, that the Lao government would be having to borrow at such an expensive rate. In early 2020, Fitch and Moody's rating agencies issued their first sovereign credit ratings of Laos. And in the case of Moody's, Laos started off okay at a B3 positive outlook, which is still speculative grade, while Fitch offered a B- stable rating. So the Lao economy has certainly been slowing from 2013, but then as the COVID shocks start, you see these credit downgrades starting to accelerate, as indicated on the slide here. The COVID crisis was a precipitating event, but the issues go deeper than just the COVID shock, and we argue relate to the large increases in debt obligations, especially from Electricity du Laos, the state energy company. The World Bank and rating agency reports highlight problems with issues like the ratio of debt to exports, which indicate an ability to generate foreign exchange to pay down debt, the country's currency reserves, exchange rates and inflation risks, and overall transparency with the debt profile. So while the ongoing COVID crisis has been a catalyst, the seeds of the debt crisis have been building for longer. So here's just a bit of a snapshot on the current situation of sovereign debt in Laos. And this is drawn from the World Bank's Lao Economic Monitor from January. So public debt at around 70% of GDP in 2020, which is not spectacularly high when you consider a country like Japan, but then again, Laos is not a major world economy with a reserve bank that can engage in things like quantitative easing or being able to issue debt fairly easily. The Lao government will need to make an average of US $1.1 billion in debt repayments between 2021 and 2025, while foreign exchange reserves sit at 1.35 billion, so slightly larger. Debt repayments projected to average 55% of domestic revenues from 2020 to 2023. There's been, of course, the COVID shocks in tourism and labor remittances, and a current account deficit at 11% of GDP. So Laos is becoming a significant net borrower from the rest of the world. In March 2021, and for the third time since December of 2020, the Bank of Laos was forced to abruptly withdraw a US dollar bond offering, paying around 10% yield this time. And I noted that the online journal International Financial Review had an article which stated that, as highlighted in the text, that Laos had disclosed in the offering documents for this deal that it had breached terms of its external loans. In 2007, it took a loan to finance the Nam Nguyen 2 project, and in another in 2014 to fund Nam Nghiep 1 and Sapien Zainam Noi projects. Both times it granted security over assets that was prohibited by negative pledge covenants in agreements with China's Exim Bank, the ADB, Exim Bank of Thailand, and other commercial banks, putting it in breach of these covenants. So basically, it seems as though Laos was sort of double dipping on some of their hydropower assets in order to raise money. So it's all starting to feel a little bit like Hemingway's famous quote, "In the sun also rises." How did you go bankrupt? Two ways: first gradually, and then suddenly. With the new five-year party Congress in early 2021, the government lineup has placed this economic crisis at the top of the government's agenda. Speaking to a country economist recently, the idea was that an outright debt default was probably the less likely scenario for Laos, as at worst, the government could at least access their foreign exchange reserves to pay for some of the upcoming debt repayments, at least for the next year or two. But it seems clear that the upcoming debt repayments are placing significant pressure on the government spending at a time when Laos is struggling with the COVID crisis. And so there's little fiscal room to support a domestic response to that. And this has been made even worse by, in the last couple of weeks, Laos has re-entered a lockdown with new outbreaks of COVID. It seems as though a greater amount of debt transparency will be very important, at least if Laos wishes to receive further assistance from the multilateral banks and or access funding through financial markets. So other than the COVID shock, a key question is, what are the core drivers of debt vulnerability in Laos, and how does it relate to hydropower development and Chinese lending? In their economic monitor from January, the World Bank places emphasis on short maturity commercial borrowing at high interest rates, commercial loans and bonds, as the key factor in the large debt repayments coming due. So it's those sort of non-concessional commercial loans and non-concessional commercial bonds in the red rectangles here, which are identified as the most immediate and direct source of debt distress, as opposed to other loan categories coming from China or elsewhere. But to me, it's not really quite clear what is included in that red non-concessional commercial loan box. And here we can recall that the China Development Bank has been at the center of disputes between the World Bank and the People's Republic of China regarding what gets called public financing or private financing. The World Bank considers China Development Bank to be a public or state lender, and that therefore they should participate in joint debt restructuring, while China considers the China Development Bank as a commercial lender, and so it should not. So I'm not sure what are these non-concessional commercial loans that Laos has been accessing. It'd be very interesting to get more information on that, and specifically why the Lao government chose to access such expensive sources of credit. Meanwhile, the second red box, the non-concessional commercial bond box, are indeed charging high interest rates, but again, it seems to me that bondholders would seek higher yields due to perceived underlying weaknesses and risks in a sovereign economy and a country's capacity to manage that debt. So the fact that bondholders are asking for nearly 7 or even up to 10% annual yields on their government of Laos bonds seems like more of a proximate issue that in and of itself does not really provide a full explanation for Laos's debt distress. As for the government of Laos, in the same Economic Monitor report from January, they put the focus for debt distress on, first of all, hydropower financing, and second of all, projects that did not yield an economic return, which includes, I would say, numerous hydropower projects. So this brings us to the state-owned energy utility, Electricity du Laos. So Laos's total external debt is maybe at 17 billion in 2019, of which 10 billion is public and publicly guaranteed debt. EDL accounts for up to 8 billion of that sovereign debt, up to 41% of GDP, although I've also seen some figures of only 5 billion. EDL debt servicing is set to increase from 400 million to 800 million by 2023, as noted in the chart here, and staying above the $600 million level up to 2030. So it's interesting to focus in on EDL and understand their position in the Laos state. I think it's fair to say that EDL can be considered a state-owned industrial champion for socialist Laos. And we can think back to Lenin's dictum that communism is Soviet power plus electrification of the whole country. So that can give you a sense of how socialist governments tend to view the role of these sort of key state enterprises in fueling socialism. Prior to the creation of EDL Transmission Company in late 2020, EDL held a monopoly over domestic energy transmission and distribution in Laos. EDL participates in electricity projects as a minority partner in foreign-backed IPP projects or as a sole owner investor. And notably, it's located under the Ministry of Energy and Mines, but the Ministry of Finance also plays a key role, including on debt financing decisions. Unlike for the publicly listed EDL Gen company, there's no independent financial auditor for EDL. Rather, internal non-disclosed reviews are conducted by Laos's state audit organization and the Ministry of Finance. And the chair of the board of directors of EDL is appointed by the Minister of Finance. So this is a crucial point here. Since 2015, China's Exim Bank has financed EDL and EDL Gen to launch fully owned and operated dam projects targeting the domestic market. Moreover, other key projects targeting the domestic market, such as the massive Nam U Cascade in northern Laos, were also financed by Chinese lenders, in this case, China Development Bank. So this expansion into new projects focused on the domestic market was all occurring in a context in which, as mentioned earlier, there is this unfinished domestic power grid, which limits transmission options to different load centers around the country. And the next two charts just sort of highlight China's central role in financing dam projects targeting the domestic market. And this slide just shows the central role of China's Exim Bank in financing fully owned EDL and EDL Gen projects. And the next slide just highlights funding from China's Exim Bank and China Development Bank in supporting a broader range of projects targeting the domestic market. So a question is, why would EDL and EDL Gen launch so many projects targeting the domestic power market? In particular, why promote the massive Nam U cascade in northern Laos, which simply adds to this domestic oversupply? And we can recall that the Nam U cascade is a huge cascade of dams, 7 dams located on the U River, which is sort of the main tributary of the Mekong running through northern Laos. It's overall over 1,200 megawatt series of projects, $2.7 billion, constructed by Sino-Hydro, operated by Power China, financed by China Development Bank under the Belt and Road Initiative. And this series of dams seems to be at the center of domestic oversupply problems. And so far, at least, you know, the dam construction seems to have been for little benefit. There is, in fact, a massive surplus of power in the Lao domestic market, even as they hope that the new Lao China Railway will help to soak up some of that output from the Nam U cascade. While the government of Laos holds just a 15% share in the Nam U cascade, which appears to limit exposure to its overcapacity problem, the key issue is that the government of Laos signed take-or-pay contracts with Power China, in which EDL, or the government of Laos, must pay for every kilowatt hour generated from the Nam U cascade, whether or not there is an actual end user. And this relates back to this issue of over-projected domestic supply demand scenarios. In a report from 2020, JICA indicated that the current electricity generated from existing and under construction power projects for domestic supply in Laos will exceed demand until at least 2027. And a rather sardonic writer of that report noted that it is clear that EDL experienced challenges not only in long-term forecasting, but also in short-term forecasting, such as 1-year forecasting for dam project for electricity demand. In one of his draft chapters, Ganya estimates that in 2019, the domestic supply was an astounding 190% higher than the domestic reserve margin, a figure of excess energy capacity that might be without parallel worldwide, although maybe some energy sector specialists here might be able to comment on that. So 190% oversupply over the domestic reserve margin. The JICA report notes that EDL's overestimated forecast follows the Lao Ministry of Planning and Investment's very optimistic GDP growth targets. However, we might suggest that the Ministry of Planning and Investment may have reviewed and approved such targets aiming to achieve the 5-year national social and economic development plans that are oriented towards political calculations and party goals as opposed to detailed expert economic modeling. The anticipated growth relies heavily on mega infrastructure and resource projects, including mining, the Lao China Railway, and special economic zones, many of which had been delayed or starting more slowly than expected. This was done even though at the time of the forecast, many of these projects remained uncertain or in their early stages or showed potential to be economically unfeasible. And so the detail of how all this works is important. And I'll just mention 2 key points here. The first relates to so-called EPCs, or engineering, procurement, construction contracts. Under the EPC contracts, Chinese bilateral loans were typically recycled back into Chinese engineering and construction companies, including Sino-Hydro, Sinomac, and China National Heavy Machinery Corporation. To give an indication of the value of these contracts, just one of them involving the China Exim financed Namngum 4 project in Laos in 2015 involved a design, build, and turnkey agreement of over $700 million. So the financing from China's policy banks is largely being recycled back into Chinese construction companies, and this sort of helps alleviate their own dam overproduction problems within China. This mechanism also appears to have provided scope for inflated cost structures and rent seeking, particularly for Laos state-owned dam development and transmission line construction projects, as noted by the ADB in 2019. The second key point is this issue of take or pay contracts. And as mentioned, EDL agreed to these take or pay contracts with numerous domestic-focused independent power producer projects, including the Nam U Cascade, which meant that the state utility would shoulder most of the financial risk if demand for that energy did not materialize, which indeed it has not. There has been some suggestion that the government of Laos has tried to negotiate a delay to the second phase of the Nam U involving the 4 dams, but was not successful. As a result of this, EDL has had to reduce capacity utilization on some of its own brand new fully state-owned dam facilities, such as the 2 Nam Can dams in Luang Prabang province, and instead to continue purchasing the output from the Nam U phase 1 dams in an effort to limit the impact of breaking the take or pay contracts with Power China. So the government of Laos and EDL seems to be under some pressure because if it cannot find solutions to the domestic overcapacity problems, they may need to relinquish other state assets, such as sole-owned EDL dams or potentially even mining assets to meet the obligations to Power China and their financial backers. Exactly why EDL signed these take-or-pay contracts is something that we have not been able to find clear answers for. So in the paper, we then go through a series of options for the government of Laos to try to find its way out of this sort of debt credit predicament that it's found itself in. A series of debt for equity swaps have been ongoing, and there may be more to come. And in the paper, we first outline a so-called triangle debt diversion disbursement initiative, which seems to be, as far as I can understand, a scheme to revolve the debt loads between different actors within Laos, between the government, the domestic banks, and some Lao infrastructure contractors. Second, in these debt for equity swaps has been a sale of 25% of Laos's position in EDL Gen to 2 domestic contractors, seemingly with good links to Vietnam. Third, and this was a big one, spinning off EDL Transmission Company and selling 90% of that to China Southern Power Grid over a 40-year concession agreement. And this one has been highlighted in the media quite a bit as an example of sort of the outcomes of so-called debt trap diplomacy. Recently, there's been reported a sale of shares in the Lao state-owned Lao Development Bank and the Agriculture Promotion Bank, which are held under the Ministry of Finance, to those 2 previously mentioned domestic construction contractors. And lastly, there's potential for selling equity stakes in fully owned EDL projects, such as Namngum 3, to try to pay down some of the debt. Other options for Laos at this point, as far as I was able to trace, would involve further private borrowing through international bond markets, either in Thai baht or US dollars. But this is made more difficult by the low credit ratings and disclosure issues, including the double dipping on the leverage on some of their dam assets that I mentioned. Second can be multilateral and bilateral COVID-19 support programs, and there has been some assistance, and Australia itself has been providing assistance on this. Third, participating in an IMF rapid credit facility program, but this would require undergoing a full IMF treatment or a program on debt restructuring, which the government of Laos seems interested to avoid if possible. Fourth is participation in the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, or its more recent incarnation, the G20 Common Framework for Debt Restructuring, the latter which would involve China more directly. However, Fitch Ratings Agency considers that participation in the G20 Common Framework would constitute a default event. So basically, the international credit rating agencies are sort of warning developing countries that rescheduling their debt would place even more pressure on their credit ratings in this manner. Fifth, an option for Laos would be to participate in the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization Program. And this is a $240 billion fund set up specifically as a strategy for Asian member states to avoid IMF debt restructuring programs. And that, if you remember, this was set up in response to the 1997-98 Asian financial crisis. But for Laos, the options are a little bit limited here because you can only take out 5 times of what you put in. So in Laos' case, since they contributed $60 million, 5 times of that would be $300 million. And only 40% of the swap can be accessed without following IMF conditions, which reduces this down to 140 million for Laos. So even the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization, which is kind of set up as an alternative to IMF programs, above a certain level, they still find themselves having to follow basic IMF debt restructuring principles. Sixth, the ADB has COVID active response and expenditure support programs. And those could start to kick in now that Laos has a new outbreak of COVID. Previously, their number of COVID cases was just too low to qualify for this, but now I'm sure that they could qualify for this. And lastly, and the strategy which seems to have been followed, is further direct negotiations with China as the major bilateral creditor, including through China-Lao currency swaps. And there was an announcement recently of a $900 million currency swap provided by the People's Bank of China to the Bank of Laos. Although I note that the currency swap was earmarked for paying for Chinese imports, so it's not really a financial asset on the balance sheet of the Central Bank of Laos. Other escape routes from the debt situation can include things like more economic growth in the coming years, and the Lao China Railway will be really critical in either facilitating or hindering this. My understanding is that Laos will probably seek to set up a series of industrial zones along the railway, and the idea is that these can link to more domestic power demand. But again, the railway might add more to the debt burden in the short term. Another option is completion of that domestic transmission grid, and that's where the sale of EDL Transmission Company to China Southern Power Grid becomes really important. So basically, if Laos, with their Chinese investors, can complete the domestic transmission grid, then the overcapacity issues of certain dam projects can either be rerouted to demand centers within Laos or exported to demand centers in places like Vietnam or Thailand. So exporting excess electricity production from those domestic dams to neighboring countries, this will be really central in the coming years. The paper also outlines potential further reforms that the Lao government could follow, including reorganization of EDL under the Ministry of Energy and Mines. There seems to be some changes afoot, but there's been no announcements on what that might involve. Second, controlling EDL's costing of domestic infrastructure through increasing the role of line agencies at provincial and district levels to monitor performance. Third, we suggest suspending EDL's existing pipeline of EPC contracts involving both dams and transmission infrastructure. And there's also the option to shelve several planned coal-fired power plants that are targeting the Cambodian market. So, that is an option, although if they set up their own transmission lines, then that might not affect the domestic overcapacity issue. In general, we think that Laos will try to find room to maneuver and seek to maintain state control over key assets while managing and balancing the role of foreign actors in dominating the hydropower sector to the extent that they are able to. Clearly, Laos does not wish to lose sovereignty over strategic state assets, but their options seem to have narrowed. Poorly planned and non-transparent approvals of dam projects and take-or-pay contracts by the Ministry of Energy and Mines, or EDL, we think are primary causes of the ongoing situation of electricity oversupply and debt crisis. As a result, the government of Laos has had to partly privatize some of its strategic state assets, namely the domestic transmission company. Regarding a China debt trap interpretation, Kenya might have his own views on this, but from my perspective, there are a lot of unknowable things that would have had to exactly fall into place if this was somehow being all centrally orchestrated from Beijing. But I would say that there has been some reckless lending by China's policy banks and reckless borrowing from EDL, leading to a generalized situation of debt distress in which a Chinese firm has taken control over a major Lao sovereign asset.